Tile out, light in. She found the tile in the dish rack at first light. Chalk dust on the plates, like someone had tried to write a message and given up halfway. The rental's kitchen had a way of adjusting itself overnight. Nothing dramatic, just small failures rotated through the parts that took turns being tired. A hinge went slack, a drawer swelled and learned to stick. The cheap blind twisted in its brackets and made the light arrive meaner than it had the day before. She lifted the tile, ran a thumb along the edge, and felt the old plaster behind it crumble into white grit. A dark coin of space showed where a wall should be. What showed through did not belong to her room. At first, she thought it was the crawl of dawn in the vent, some trick of a neighbor's window aligning to hers. She bent close and set one eye where light should not be. Through that peephole, a kitchen settled into view, laid out like hers, but washed in a steadier sun. Herbs drank from a jar on a narrow sill the way thirsty hands do when nobody is watching. The counters kept their promises. The kettle there shone like a bell and pretended it had never been a cheap thing. A woman moved within that frame sleeves rolled, wrist quick with a whisk. Nothing crossed, not a sound. Only light, richer, lemon-colored, as if the world on that side respected daylight enough to polish it. She leaned back because leaning further would have meant pushing her face into a wall, and that felt like crossing a line no lease would cover. The tile lay in her palm. She fetched tape from the drawer that held other failed solutions and made a bandage of it. The tile stuck like a child who has promised to behave. By night, the tape gave up its pretense. Before morning, the tile was back in the dish rack with the resigned air of a worker at the wrong station. She stopped arguing with it. She cleaned her own grout. She lifted her blinds and told them to hold their posture a little longer. She set a jar for basil on the sill with a hope that could afford to be foolish. She laid a clean towel over bread dough the way the other hands did, even though her bread had never quite made it past earnest. At noon, the kettles on both sides lifted, a small synchronized act as if the light had whispered a schedule. Steam rose on that side. On this one, water hesitated as if it were waiting to be introduced to the idea. A beat later, it found its voice and sang, thin and relieved. Sometimes the other woman turned, not toward the hole exactly, but toward the wall that had learned to be a window. She set a second cup near the peephole. Handle turned toward the place where the tile ought to be. On her own counter, a spare cup began to live near the gap too. The two emptinesses faced each other like open palms. When the landlord's paint flaked like a winter sunburn, she sanded until the powder made small clouds above the sink. When the bulb hummed with the cheap impatience of fluorescence, she replaced it with warmer light, even though the lease said tenants must not tamper. The peephole kept its brighter truth, but her room began to answer in its own key. On a night when rain made the building confess where it wasn't sealed right, she let the tile rest on the counter and left the hole open. The two kitchens breathed through it, and supper tasted less alone. She learned the measure of the light. On mornings when her own window sulked, the glow through the peephole steadied her hands. On afternoons, when work drained her and left her smelling like copy toner and stale carpet, she stood with one palm on the counter and let the lemon wash of the other room brighten the tiles. If she was careful with her angle, she could make out more. Hooks by the door where neat aprons hung, a broom with bristles that had not yet learned to splay, a bowl with a crack repaired so gracefully the flaw had become the point. Her own kitchen had a refrigerator with a loose handle and a motor that performed pridefully after midnight. The countertops were faux stone, soft at the edges where too many wrists had rested, leaving a field of small moons. The faucet dripped in a rhythm that mocked sleep. In that first week after the tile failed, she started opening the window, even when the street fought back with its noise and its exhaust, just to let the air speak to the hole. The room smelling less trapped meant she could stand to cook again. She learned the other woman's rhythm by watching. It was unremarkable in the way all good rituals are. There was coffee made in a glass pot with a thin collar of steam above it and no waste. There was a pan warmed slowly, not rushed, the way a pan must be if it is to perform its old magic. There was dough turned out of a bowl and taught how to behave by hands that had practiced. When the whisk flashed, it did not throw anything where it did not belong. When the oven door opened, heat did not spill and complain. It introduced itself and waited to be thanked. She tried not to stare. She had learned from neighbors, from train platforms, from the thin slice of privacy you get on an elevator, that the kindest thing you can do is sometimes look away. But the peephole was small. The other kitchen was entire. Looking became a way to tune her own room to the right pitch. She tried to whisk without splashing, to cut without hacking, to scrape a bowl with a patience that left no waste. The first time the other woman seemed to notice her looking, she did not startle. She simply placed 2 cups by the hole, one on either side, as if setting out hands for someone to hold without deciding who would do the holding. The handles pointed toward the wall, poised to be turned. Steam rose on that side. On this one, there was only breath. She could smell mint when she leaned close, or believed she could. It occurred to her that believing might be as useful as proof. She began to set her own table as if someone were coming by, not in a way that invited disappointment, but in a way that reminded the body what it feels like to expect company. A second plate sat above the place where a person's hand would land at the end of a day. A napkin waited to be unfolded. The first evening she did this, the other kitchen lit a candle, and the smoke rose thin and straight, and she could not pretend it was for any reason other than the one she carried in her throat. Her job sent emails that used the word deliverable more than any word should be asked to work. Clients called the office line and practiced panic. The building's hallways smelled like bleach when they were clean and like mop water when they were not. At lunch, people walked through their meals staring into their palms. She went home tired of her own name. In her kitchen, the hole held light and did not ask for speech. She stood there long enough to feel the day's noise settle. She began to time her breath to the small adjustments of the other woman's hands, a whisk slowing, a kettle settling back on its ring, a sliced apple browning in the air like a fist unclenching. The whole taught her discipline the way a forgiving teacher does, by leaving space where a mistake could have lived and not making a fuss when the student corrects it. If she left the tile aside overnight, the light came through with a polite insistence, even when her room felt drafted and thin. If she set the tile back, the light turned to a dull coin behind it, and her own bulbs showed their cheap souls. She learned to let the hole breathe when the weather minded itself, and to cover it when the street outside slapped too hard at her thin windows. On a Friday that had not decided what kind of trouble to be yet, the landlord put a note under the door saying something about an inspection and the importance of uniform fixtures. She turned the paper over as if a second page would admit a better plan. She looked at the hole's perfect circle and at the tile that no longer wanted its old life. She imagined the landlord standing here with a clipboard and a face that had practiced indifference until it stuck. She pictured a hand scraping at the edge of the hole, measuring, sealing. She felt heat rise in her face that had nothing to do with the kettle. She wrote a reply on the landlord's note in small, steady letters. The kitchen is in use. Please schedule. She taped it outside. She left the tile off the wall in a small act of faith. That night brought rain that started as a polite idea and kept its manners for longer than weather usually does. She let the water drum and did not turn up the television to fight it. She sliced garlic thin as paper and wanted the smell to travel through the hole to prove it could. When she leaned close to the gap, something warm rushed her cheek. The other kitchen's steam hugged her skin for the space of one breath. She laughed into the gap and did not hear herself, But she saw the other woman turn and take a second cup down from the hook, as if responding to an announcement. They poured at the same moment without meaning to. The two kitchens breathed into the same air, and supper tasted more like supper. She noticed small correspondences. When her blind stuck halfway up, the other window's curtains settled into a fold that saved the light from glare. When her fridge motor stuttered in apology for its age, the polished kettle shone a little brighter, as if to lend confidence to metal. A line of ants found her sugar and marched orderly towards a crack in the baseboard. The other side produced a neat jar with a lid that fit, and after she went to the store to buy the same, the ants left with the dignity of soldiers dismissed. These were not miracles. They were nudges, the slight shift that happens when one room believes in the competence of another room nearby. She began to repair what she could without asking permission. She sanded a soft spot on the windowsill until paint came away in easy curls, then smoothed primer in thin, even strokes. She tightened a hinge that had been generous with its complaints. She took the humming bulb out and wound in a warmer one. The other kitchen did not dim. It did not gloat. It remained a kind of proof of concept. Her room came a little closer to being a place where a day could end without arguing. She slept better, not because the world had softened, but because her kitchen had decided to carry part of what the dark kept in its pockets. When she woke to the thin whine of pipes complaining, she matched her breath to the pulse she could feel under her fingers at the edge of the hole. The pulse was not a noise. It was the measure of a routine. It was a whisk tapping the side of a bowl just once to be sure. It was a hand placing a towel over dough with a confidence that came from failing often and not quitting. The first time the other woman looked straight at the peephole, it was like watching someone respond to her own name across a train station. No startle, no smile meant to ease both parties. Just a short, decisive turn, a narrowing of the gaze, a question posed without the expectation of answer. The question was simple. Are you there? She pressed her fingertips to the wall, just to answer with pressure. The other woman placed her palm on her own side, and the light changed, not brighter, but warmer. They left their hands in place long enough for heat to travel. When they pulled away, the circle of plaster on her side held a faint print of warmth. It faded slow as a bruise. On mornings, when work wanted her early, she would boil water for eggs, while the other woman brewed coffee in a glass pot. The steam on that side pulled itself into a steady thread, no waste. Her own steam wandered and argued, and settled into a line as if it had learned manners. She found herself timing small tasks to the other woman's pace. Crack the eggs now, salt after the second turn, lift the pot when the light falls on the corner of the sink. It felt ridiculous. It felt necessary. A friend came by once, the kind who looks around and adjusts a mouth to match the room's energy. The friend saw the tile on the counter and the jar of basil on the sill, and the way the blinds had been convinced to keep straight. She nodded at the improvements and said something careful about the place looking happier. The friend did not see the hole until she set a cup down and the light slid into it like a coin into a slot. She leaned close then and peered in and straightened and peered again and laughed, because laughter is what people do when a thing asks too much of their voice. She said, "There's nothing there." She said it again, as if brave. The other light persisted. The friend coughed and left soon after, saying she had to be up before dawn for a training that would likely misuse the word teamwork. She moved the tile closer to the edge of the counter so she could cover the hole quickly if someone arrived. The tile learned the weight of her hand and behaved when she needed it to. On most nights, it lay aside, a little ballast to keep papers from escaping the draft. The peephole watched. The other kitchen did what kitchens do. Nothing about it felt like a trap. Everything about it felt like a suggestion. There were small pressures from the world that kept her honest. A boil water advisory went up in the building, and the office sent a message with a list of instructions that contradicted themselves. She filled a pot and set it on the burner and waited. The other kettle lifted its lid to breathe for a moment and then settled back and did its job without complaint. When steam rose thick and patient in both rooms, she slept at the table to the sound of nothing being wrong for the duration of that water. The landlord rescheduled the inspection twice and then came at a time when she was home and not ready. He knocked with a knuckle that had perfected the art of knocking without apology. She set the tile in place and met him at the door. He walked the kitchen with his clipboard, checking boxes that had been printed long ago by someone who believed in the list as a means of salvation. He tapped the counter, glanced at the blinds, jotted something about bulbs. His eyes passed over the tile and did not linger. He cautioned her against painting. He advised against boiling water for too long. He left the way men leave when they have performed what they consider to be a kindness. She removed the tile after he went out. The hole had learned to behave in the landlord's presence. That was new. She felt a gratitude so big she had to make her hand small for a while to hold it. She washed the cups, both of them, and lined them up like twins raised in different households. Shadows in her kitchen were less mean now. They learned to sit higher, as if the light in the other room had told them to lift their chins. She found a kind of companionable silence lived here that had not before. When she spoke, the words showed up wearing work clothes and did their jobs without asking to be admired. She did not speak often. She did not need to. On a day when the building's dryer failed and laundry hung from lines and windows like flags of surrender, she saw the other woman pin a cloth on her side with a little wooden peg that looked hand-whittled. She saw the cloth catch the light and hold it. She lowered her eyes to the tub in her own sink and decided to hand-wash the few things she could not afford to send out. The water on her side clouded and then cleared. Her fingers went wrinkled and strong with the work. The other woman wrung a towel with 2 quick twists and hung it. She tried the same motion and felt the cloth give up what it had been holding. The satisfaction was so precise, it made a shape in her chest. The hole grew, but only if she was not looking. One morning it accepted the edge of the tile too easily, like a mouth that has learned to hold a spoon. Another night, the tape would not catch at all, and she told herself the wall had decided to heal. The opening did not widen by any measure you could write down. It opened the way a habit opens, with a degree of permission that only becomes obvious after it has succeeded. She began noticing a faint scent coming through when the other oven door opened, something citrus and something warm, a note like clean cloth left near a window. In return, she placed her little basil plant closer to the hole and crushed a leaf now and then in hope of sending the smell of green in that direction. Sometimes the other woman paused, lifted her head, and smiled in a closed-mouth way that meant not joy exactly, but recognition. None of it was proof. All of it was enough. The first gift arrived without announcement. A snippet of recipe, hand-copied on a slip of paper, slid through the opening and landed by the dish rack where the tile liked to sleep. The handwriting was precise without being fancy. The words spoke of flour and salt and water and patience. There were no amounts. There were only actions and a reminder to trust one's hands. She held the paper like something that had been inside a person and had to be handled gently to keep from bruising it. She propped it on the windowsill and did as it asked for the length of one afternoon. The dough she made rose willing and brave. The bread she turned out was not beautiful in any way a photograph would forgive, but it opened with a sigh that made her believe the air in both rooms had agreed on a neutral truce. She slipped a note back through with her thanks written without flowery sentences. She said only that the bread had worked and that she now understood the instruction about patience. She included, because it felt relevant, the way the light looked on her counter when the loaf finally tore as it should. The note did not return. There was no expectation that it would. The exchange had been completed by being risked. Some nights the world still pressed on her with the clumsy hands of a bad dream. The office called late. A client practiced fear into her ear until her shoulder cramped. The building lost power and found it again. Sirens tore the street's story into ragged strips. On such nights, she covered the hole with the tile, because she did not want to spill that kind of weather into someone else's room. The tile lay there like a lid on a pot that would otherwise spit. The dark inside her kitchen grew slightly heavier when she did this, but it stayed where it belonged. In the morning, she lifted the tile and let light in as an apology. The other kitchen never looked offended. It kept its chores. When the first cold brushed the building's bones from the outside, she found a small draft at the baseboard and stuffed it with cloth. Through the hole, the other woman hung a thicker curtain than the summer had allowed. The light dimmed without losing its warmth. They boiled soups in parallel, one with lentils, one with beans, each with the confidence of cheap ingredients made to feel precious. The steam from both rooms touched in the opening and did not condense. It joined and passed on. Once, in the pale hour before daylight settles, she woke to a soft scrape in the kitchen. She walked barefoot to the doorway and stood listening. Through the hole, the other woman stood listening too. They waited, each in their own quiet, until the building's elevator rattled itself back to bed somewhere down the hall. The other woman laughed with her mouth closed and shook her head the way people do when migrating metal winds around. She lifted her kettle, and the reflection on its side caught a shape like the outline of two women sharing inconvenience with dignity. The kettle shone like a bell again. A weather advisory arrived on paper under the door, telling the building that heat would be reduced, while something large and expensive was replaced on the roof. She set an extra blanket near the foot of the bed and cooked things that gave off heat as a side effect of being delicious. Through the hole, the other kitchen carried warmth, like a person carries a sleeping child from a car to a quiet room. She stood at the counter with her palms flat until the blood in them learned steadiness again. A visitor from her old life wrote to say they would be in town, and could they meet while their conference handled itself. She hesitated and said yes, because refusing would require a story her mouth did not want to hear. The visitor arrived with a coat that suggested success and a smile that did not. He looked around her kitchen and said little. He looked at the tile on the counter, and at the basil stubborn on the sill, and at the neatness that had replaced the rental's old slump. He said, "You seem better," which was a way of saying, "You did not used to be." She made tea without making a speech. When he left, she put both hands to the wall and breathed until she had the measure of herself back. The crack around the peephole formed a tiny raised rim of plaster she sanded until it turned to fine snow. The circle looked cleaner after. She oiled the wooden spoon that had begun to look thirsty. She lined the drawer so the forks would quit scraping at the bottom. She replaced the cracked plastic dish rack with something steadier. The other kitchen did not register any of these as favors either of them owed the other. It maintained its sun the way a wall maintains its square. On a morning when the street below smelled like cold iron and bus brake, she sat at the table with a list of tasks and felt the old narrowing in her chest that came when the day asserted itself, like a manager who had missed a meal. She touched the hole with the back of her fingers and found it warm. On the other side, the woman had placed her palm there as if to call for patience. The warmth steadied. She let the list be folded once and then twice, and then left under the salt until it decided to behave. Sometimes a small sound reached her, not enough to be trusted, just enough to trick a body into thinking a kettle on the far side had a different, more forgiving kind of whistle. She stopped hunting for proof. She allowed the room to show her how to live in it. She noticed after a while that the old noises, the bulb's cheap drone, the fridge's boast, the tap's pained cough had all softened. They had not disappeared. They had learned to speak inside the measure set by another kitchen's competence. She began, without announcing it to herself, to keep the tile in a drawer rather than on the counter. If the landlord came again, she could fetch it. If someone asked a question she could not answer, she could cover the hole and show them only her own room. She discovered that the drawer trick soothed the tiny citizen inside her that insisted on being prepared. The rest of her got to remain at ease. Then came the night. The tape tugged gently at itself and made a small sound that felt like a decision. She went to the counter and found the tile had slid halfway of its own accord, as if a hand beneath had eased it aside. She did not pretend to be surprised. She lifted the tile away and leaned it against the wall like a picture not yet hung. The opening widened by the width of a fingernail, then held. She could see more now. The edge of a sink with a porcelain lip, the end of a towel smoothed as if hands that knew it had just left. Her own sink looked back at her from another life. She scrubbed it with a paste of baking soda and lemon in deliberate circles and rinsed slowly until the porcelain shone. She draped a towel with 2 patient hands and pulled it straight. On the other side, a towel's edge aligned itself as if magnetized. She said thank you aloud and did not need to hear it return to know that the air had filed it where it belonged. The old life kept sending messengers. An email from work lay in her phone and made a sound that used to command obedience. She let it lie. A bill came addressed wrongly, as if to a past version of her who would have accepted penalties without questions. She made the call to fix it and felt only slight tremor afterward. She ran her hand under the faucet and let the water cool, then warm, then cool again, reminding nerves of the space they had to move. The other kitchen remained free of little humiliations. No mismatched set of spoons clattered in a drawer. No chipped cup hid at the back. Yet even there she saw signs of a life that allowed error. A scorch on a wooden spoon, S-handle and nick on the edge of a cutting board, sanded smooth, a corner of tile missing in a spot that did not announce itself readily. The grace lay in how small failures had been folded into the day until they belonged. The lesson did not feel like a command. It felt like a jacket offered without comment on a sudden cold evening. One evening, while rain taught the gutter the same old song again, she saw the other woman lift a paper off the counter and pin it near the hole. A schedule of chores written in a hand that did not insult the tasks by making them cute. Wash, sweep, peel, rise, mend. She did not read all the words. She recognized the kind of promise they made to the day, and she answered by sweeping her own floor, patient and thorough, not pretending the broom was beneath anyone's education. The dustpan filled with fine grit and a few dead flies, and the buried shine of the floor appeared and held. The next morning, a scrap edged through on her side, a list in her own shy print of the small rituals that kept her kitchen honest. Wipe the stove when it is cool. Do not leave the sponge to sour. Set the knife back in its sheath so it can be found without hurt. She had not written it on purpose. The act of keeping parallel had produced an index. She smiled at the silliness of a note that no one else would ever see and tacked it to her own wall beside the hole. Sun from the other kitchen lit the pencil just enough to make the letters look like they were still thinking. The building sighed deep one afternoon, the way an old horse does when it decides not to object to the saddle after all. A neighbor cried quietly through the wall. A child somewhere below practiced the whistle they had not yet earned and failed kindly at it. Through the hole, a woman set out 2 plates again, as she had on the first days, and looked into the space between kitchens as if listening for someone walking down a hall toward her. On both counters, a quiet space waited where an elbow might be comfortable. As the days folded over one another without making a mess, she felt less like she was borrowing from the other kitchen and more like both rooms were borrowing from a third place where competence is weather and kindness is an appliance. She started humming again, not loudly, not with the fear that someone might hear and think it cute or pathetic, but the way you hum when water is doing what it should and the knife is sharp, and the pan knows you are not going to lie to it. When she brought home stems of parsley with yellowing underleaves from a grocer who acted like produce needed forgiveness, she trimmed them and set them in water and watched them straighten as if teased by attention. The other jar on the other sill grew taller just then, in her peripheral vision, and she chose not to doubt it. She rubbed oil into the wooden board until it darkened, and the kitchen smelled a little like a clean barn. She learned to let the kettle cool before filling it again so that it would not resent the shock. When she forgot, it did not punish her. It just took an extra beat to sing. The whole began to belong to the house. There was no need to cover it for company, because she had stopped inviting the kind of people who required rooms to lie. The landlord came by once to drop off a note and did not step in. The light at his shoulder went thin, and he stood on the threshold like a man realizing he has walked too close to a line that he cannot see. He wished her well in a voice that had not practiced saying it and left. On a night when the sky spit a kind of wet that made the city smell like its own wiring, she put a pan on the burner and let onions think. She watched them until they admitted sweetness. Through the opening, a hand did the same work. The two pans took their time, neither trying to impress the other by hurrying. She tasted and nodded at no one. The other woman lifted a spoon, tasted, and nodded at the idea of the day. Then the hole widened enough to show a corner of a face, a cheekbone, the beginning of an ear, a piece of jaw with a small scar, pulled tight by years of laughing without time to be careful. It lasted a breath. It was as if the opening itself had taken a fuller inhale. She stepped closer and the space exhaled, returning to the known circle. She did not feel refused. She felt cautioned in the generous way hands caution when they guide a shoulder under a little lower than expected. She slept late the next morning, not by much, just long enough to let the building's morning noise come and go without her having to answer. When she came to the counter still warm with sleep, a thin line of flour dust lay across it as if the other kitchener's work had drifted through. She pressed a fingertip to it and lifted away a print. Her skin tasted of salt and dough where she touched her lip, and she found herself laughing at the smallness of the miracle. She laughed without sound. The other woman looked up and smiled and shook her head with that private, permission-giving humor people reserve for friends who do not need to be told the joke. The first time a fly found the opening, it paused in the circle of light like a bead on a string and then chose her side. She did not resent it. She trapped it under a glass and slid a card beneath and gave it back to the part of the world that made use of everything. When she lifted the glass, she swore she felt a faint current from the other kitchen. A small favor returned. The kettle on that side sometimes reflected a figure standing beside the other woman, taller than she, shoulders like a person who lifts without complaint. The reflection stretched and folded with the metal. It might have been a trick of light, a coat on a hook. A mop leaned just so. She did not ask for that mystery to solve itself. She contented herself with the visible, a hand that had learned not to waste spice, a habit of rinsing the cutting board the moment the cut was done, an apron that bore evidence of a life where the mess was not the point. She sent a gift that was nothing. A sprig of basil slid through the opening, the leaves bruised by travel but green enough to carry intent. She watched it vanish at the last inch as if swallowed by the light. On the other side, a jar held sprigs that might have been hers, though she had the sense to suspect there was a long line of such gifts, and none of it required ownership to matter. Later, a small square of cloth returned through the gap, hemmed with uneven stitches and smelling of a soap she did not use. She pressed it to her face and let it teach the air in her kitchen how to be clean without being scoured. On a day when her throat ached from holding back words, said at her by a man whose job title had infected his voice, she came home and did not turn on the lights. She stood by the opening and let her breathing answer the measure coming through. The other woman worked quietly, A towel over a bowl, a pot simmering, the smallest adjustment to a flame. No one asked for explanations. No one offered advice. The room held her until her shoulders lowered enough that she could stand up straight. When she finally switched on her own warmer bulb, her kitchen looked like itself, and not like the idea of a kitchen someone in a furniture store had invented. She wiped the counter in long strokes, and when the cloth caught on a nick, she sanded the place and oiled it. Through the hole, a hand did the same on a different board. Two rooms learned together how to keep wood alive. It was around then she began to think about the hole as a mouth that breathed both ways. Not a maw, not a threat. A soft mouth taking in air and letting it out with manners. She understood that closing it felt like telling the body not to yawn in a quiet room. She understood that leaving it open meant trusting the building to mind itself. She took down the calendar she kept on the fridge with the places in each day circled where dread had lived. She threw it away. In its place, she clipped a grocery receipt with items she had not bought before the hole arrived. Good salt, a lemon, flour worth the work, a decent sponge. She left it there not to remind herself of spending, but to watch the small handwriting fade in the light. The other kitchen's sun washed the paper and softened its corners, teaching it how to forgive. The city made plans without her that she could not obstruct. A parade that would clog the routes home, a water main repair that would make showers into an exercise in diplomacy with pipes, a closure of the park where she liked to stand under trees and pretend the ground could hear what she was not saying. The kitchen allowed her to weather these politely. She let the kettle sing later than usual. She took the time to peel something carefully. She put a second cup beside the hole, even when the day had not deserved a guest. A crack formed in the upper corner where the wall met the ceiling, thin as a hair, shorter than a thumb. She watched it for a week, and then scraped it and filled it and sanded, learning the patience of compounds that need a moment to decide who they are. On the other side, a similar line in the grout was cleaned and edged and made neat. She felt the small delight two living beings feel when they discover that the weather on their skin has been the same, and that each has solved a discomfort in parallel without needing to send a memo. The hole swelled subtly in warm weather. It tightened in cold. It never performed for her. It never proved itself. It simply did the work it had decided to do. The woman beyond it did not wave or mouth greetings. She reserved certain politenesses for the hands-on rhythm of the day. Set the cup, turn the handle toward the wall, wipe the rim, place the spoon quiet. It was as declarative as prayer, without any of prayer's bargaining. On the night of the first frost, she put the tile away in a drawer with clean towels and a small bag of screws that did not fit anything she owned. The hole breathed white light into her room. She watched both kitchens prepare heat against the cold, pots thickening, ovens ticking as they settled, towels fluffed as if plumped pillows invited sleep rather than cooking. She did not wish herself on the other side. She let her room be hers, and the other one be what it was, and the air between them do the kindness rooms sometimes do when they discover they can share heat without cheating. At last she fell into a routine that felt less like imitation and more like kinship. It went like this: wake, lift blinds, open the hole if the street had not been cruel, put water on, stand with palm on counter, breathe once to the other room's pace, then go about the day with that measure folded into the pocket where people keep the comb they touch before entering rooms that demand civility. She never said any of this aloud. She wrote none of it down. Yet when she looked up and saw the other woman doing the same, a hand laid flat, a blink before the first work began, she knew that the body knows its allies by the way they start the morning. She did not tell anyone. Secrets, to survive, have to be useful. This one made her apartment livable. It kept her job from swallowing her name whole. It made the street's ordinary hardness into something she could rinse off at the sink. She protected it with the ease of a person who has been given a good tool and wants to keep it in working order. When the year slid toward the cold that gets into the bones of buildings and refuses to leave until greeted properly, she oiled the hinges so the doors would not complain every time someone could be forgiven for being abrupt. Through the opening, the other kitchen hung a thick curtain before night, but left the lower edge looped up, like a smile made of fabric, to let the light leak through. They went on like that. Small gifts, small answers, the reliable exchange between two rooms that had chosen not to make a fuss about being neighbors. And once, just once, late when the building had emptied itself of footsteps and arguments and laundry machines, she heard a word. It did not come from the other room. It came from the space that belonged to both of them, the bit of air that met itself in the circle. The word was her own name, spoken the way a room says a thing after learning it the slow way, by handling it daily. It was not loud. It did not expect an answer. It did what good names do. It reminded the person wearing it how to stand. She did not sleep for a while after that. She stood with her forearms on the counter until the cold in the laminate moved into her skin and then back out. She placed 2 cups near the hole, handles turned toward the wall. On the other side, the same was done. No steam, not at that hour. Only the shape of permission, waiting for morning. She rested the tile beside the drawer, within reach and not required. The hole watched with its soft brightness, and the 2 kitchens breathed through it until dawn made a slow case for starting over.